Hello everybody and welcome back to Odin's Movie Blog. I am the critic who is a cynic, and today I'm going to be breaking down some more numbers for you, not only for Solo, but also for all box office numbers in general. And so first I want to start off with a basic premise, and that is that usually a film within the first 2 weeks of its release, especially for the big budget films, will make roughly 50% of their total gross by the end of their run. Now, this is something where you can do your own research on this, you can do your own number crunching if you want, but overall it's a pretty good standard. Now, these numbers can fluctuate, so it does not mean that every film makes 50%, but you can say that it makes at least 50%. Again, this is for bigger budget films. Again, with independent films, it's a lot harder to really tell one way or the other since they usually have several release dates depending on what territory they're in, but what we can see is that overall, 50% is a pretty good number. And so I wanted to break down some numbers for you guys just to let y'all know what numbers we've seen from Star Wars so far and what we can expect to see for Solo. And again, you can apply this to any other movie as well. So this is not just a Solo Star Wars story video, but it is also a video just in general for people who like box office numbers and want to know how much films will make. Now you'll be able to have a better understanding of how much money films actually make within those first 2 weeks and what that tells us about the future of the run. All right, so first, let's start off with the first Star Wars film in the reboots that happened. I mean, I guess not really a reboot, but a rebirth of the franchise that happened with The Force Awakens. So The Force Awakens, by the end of its first 2 weeks, it had made already over half of its total profit. So it made 52.5% of that $2 billion that it made at the box office within the first 2 weeks alone. So that means it took several months for it to make the rest of that money, to rate the remainder of the 48% that it still needed to make. With Rogue One, the number was 49.6%. So in the first 2 weeks, it made roughly half. So again, that 50% is usually pretty consistent. Again, you can have more, you can have less, and you'll see examples of this going forward. And so therefore, it had to make up the rest of the money that it needs to make in order to reach that $1 billion that it made. And now we see something very interesting because we don't see a major shift happen until, of course, The Last Jedi. The Last Jedi in its first weekend made 67.8% of its total box office earnings. So in the end, it made a roughly $1.3 billion, meaning that 68%, roughly 68% of that was made in those first 2 weeks. Now that makes a lot of sense because a lot of people were still excited after The Force Awakens. A lot of people didn't really know what this film was going to be about, and that's why everyone went to see it in the beginning, but then it didn't really make a whole lot of money after that point. Yes, it still ended up making $1.3 billion, but still, that's $700 million less than The Force Awakens had made. So again, we see that with this one, it made 67.8% within the first 2 weeks of its total gross after the end of its run. Now, if we actually break this down even further, what you'll see is that Last Jedi actually opened a week early in other parts of the world. And so when you make an adjustment for this, it actually ends up being 56.2%. Either way, well over that 50% mark. And so what I've shown so far is that when it comes to Star Wars, no Star Wars film has made less than half of what it made in the end. Well, why is this important? It's important because if that percentage is lower, it means that over the long run, it means that over time, it made more money. It made more money than it did in those first 2 weeks. But what I'm trying to show you here is that most films, especially those with big budgets, make at least half of their total earnings. But when we know that, we can actually make predictions pretty close to what the actual film will end up making in the end. So let's go ahead and go to Solo here. So Solo, it made $147 million worldwide in its opening weekend. All right, so these are the numbers that we now have. Now, assuming, since we haven't gotten to our second weekend yet, we need to do a little bit more math. So let's assume that there was a 40% drop from last weekend to this weekend. And that's pretty generous. We see a lot of times that, and I mentioned this in previous videos, where we see 60% drop. I know that we saw a huge drop. We saw a 68% drop for The Last Jedi between week 1 and week 2. Again, we know why, because people were just really not happy with the film. They were not telling other people to see it. They were not seeing it multiple times. So it makes sense that there would have been a huge drop. But even with films that people like Rogue One, there was a 60% drop there as well. And so giving this film a 40% drop, that is pretty that's pretty generous, because again, when we have a lower percentage number, what we mean is that film is making not nearly as less in that second weekend, only about 40% less, which for any movie is actually a really good percentage. So that's why, again, I'm giving this film the benefit of the doubt here. So if we give this film a 40% drop, that means next weekend the film will make $59 million. So not really not really great for a second weekend, especially when you come to know, as hopefully by the end of this you'll come to understand, that within those first 2 weeks, if you don't make half your money back, if you don't make a crap ton of money, the rest of the time, again, week 3, 4, and 5, it becomes a lot harder in order to make that money back. Well, why is that? Well, obviously you have new films coming out, and so they take a lot of the revenue too. But also, people just get bored or sour to the film. They say, oh, it's been out for a while. Maybe I'll go see it. Maybe I won't. People are less likely to see a film the longer that it's in theaters than when right when it comes out. Especially the hardcore fans. The hardcore fans are going to see it right away, and then all you have left are the casual viewers who might go see it, and that's why you see those numbers trickle down as the weeks go on. So, breaking this down even further. So we have now what it will likely make next weekend. So again, with this, and again, that's a generous 40% drop from this past weekend, it will make $59 million. All right, so let's assume that. All right, let's also assume then, because that's just for the weekend, let's also assume, and this is also being generous, that worldwide, since again, that's not until this weekend, that on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, the film made $20 million each day. So again, being generous there, it's probably going to be closer to 15. It really depends on the numbers. It's a lot harder to really track those when it comes to the foreign markets. It's a lot easier. We only really have the hard tracking numbers for local, for as far as local coverage goes, but we can still make a good estimate that $20 million, that's pretty respectable. So again, that's a pretty generous amount to give it. So $20 million on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Okay, that means that with that weekend take that I just talked about, that by the end of week 2, it will be up to $266,515,000. So again, by the end of its second week, that's the amount of money that it's going to have. Now, since we've already broken down and said that 50% is a pretty good indication or a pretty good number to talk about, especially with big budget films, as far as how much of the overall take that it's going to make, that actually takes place in this first 2 weeks, let's apply that here. So again, to be fair, let's say that this is 50% of what it's going to be making. Okay, again, that's being very fair to this, because again, we saw with The Last Jedi, it was so toxic that it only ended up being, so the percentage bit was significantly higher for that film because no one really saw it after the first 2 weeks. This one could be a case where you might not have it be as high a percentage drop because of the fact that it's not nearly as toxic, but you still don't have a whole lot of people seeing it. So 50% is still a pretty good number. Again, that's the amount that Rogue One saw in the first 2 weeks, and it's even less than what Force Awakens saw. But again, remember, the lower the number, the better it is overall for how much the movie is actually going to end up make. So with that again, with that 50% take, the total of this film, assuming all of these things come true, which again, this is being generous. This means that it's not going to make really any more than this based on these numbers, is that the total gross of this film at the end of its run is going to be $533 million, which results in a net gain, a profit, because remember, they take roughly 60% of those total box office numbers because of the deals with the distributors, things of that sort. And so therefore, they come away with $319.8 million from that, but since it cost $500 million to make, it means at least $500 million to make, it means that they end up losing $180 million. So those are some raw numbers for you, and I did want to be fair here. So let's say I take just an average of all the Star Wars films. So that means the 52.5 from Force Awakens, the 49.6 from Rogue One, and also the lower end and the higher end for the Last Jedi. So both the 67.8% when you take into account it opened a week earlier, and then also the 56.2, which is the adjusted number for that first 2 weeks, including, again, that first week and second week abroad, and not the third week abroad instead. And when you understand that, and when you make the averages of those, what you end up seeing is that you have a range. So on the low end, again, low end of Last Jedi versus the high end of Last Jedi, what you have is a range of $471 million to $505 million. Either way, if it's based on that, if it's going to make 50%, it is not looking good for this film, because as I said, most films make at least 50% of their overall gross. Again, at least 50% of their overall gross. And so based on these numbers, it is just not looking good. And you might say to yourself, oh, but you're just looking at Star Wars. Well, I did some more numbers, and I'm not going to share all of them with you, but I did some more numbers on other films, both blockbusters that did well and blockbusters that some would say flopped. And again, this is all the percentage of the total box office take within the first 2 weeks. Ready Player One, it made 68% of its total gross in the first 2 weeks. Hail Caesar, which was a flop, 52% of its total gross. Jurassic World, success, 59% in the first 2 weeks. Deadpool, success, 63% in the first 2 weeks. Wonder Woman, a success, 61%. Geostorm, a bomb, 81%. And Black Panther, a success, 55% at this point in time. And so what all these numbers are meant to show is that 50% is a pretty good indicator, but also that when it comes to actual bombs, those numbers will always be higher. Because what it means is that they made so much more money in those first 2 weeks that they made over time a smaller percentage after that point. And so that's why oftentimes marketing just dies out after the first 2 weeks of the film, because they know people aren't actually going to see these movies. And so what does this tell us about Solo? What it tells us about Solo is that there's pretty much no way at this point, seeing how low and how poorly it did in the first weekend, and seeing how poorly the projected numbers for this weekend are. So again, if for any reason there is a huge number of people that come to see it this weekend, which I just don't see happening, these numbers are going to pretty much stick, and we're going to have a really good idea about how much this film is actually going to end up making, which no matter which way you look at it is going to be $150 million loss, possibly even more than that. Again, there are some people who put the budget, the fact that they had to do reshoots, all the marketing costs, you can put this up where it's $600-700 million to actually make this film, which means you could see $300 million losses when it comes to this film by the end of its run. But again, guys, you can apply this to pretty much any film. So if you're ever interested in seeing, oh, maybe I want to try and predict box office numbers, maybe I want to try and give myself a shot at it, now you have the tools that you need to really look at. So you look at the first 2 weeks and you understand that that's likely going to be at a bare minimum 50%, because that's, again, all of these numbers I was going through. Again, I stayed away from the independent films because, again, the dates just make that a lot harder. But when it comes to when it comes to wide releases, that's what you want to look for. Films that have a wide release. If you look to the amount of money it makes within the first 2 weeks, you can get pretty good at determining the amount of money it's going to make. So if you start at 50%, that's the low end. That's about the most money, technically, low end percentage wise, but that's also the most that the film's going to make. And if you creep up higher, you can actually get a range about how much money that film is actually going to make. All right, so I'm sorry if I bored any of you guys with facts and figures, but I did want to get this video out because ever since I started doing these numbers and breaking down these numbers a few days ago, I've just become obsessed with figuring out all the ways that I can to try and show what this film is actually going to be making, what any film might actually make. And so if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. Also, I'm going to put a link to my blog where I'm going to have a breakdown of how I got to these numbers. I'm going to have actually my show notes up there for you as well, so that way you can see the numbers for yourself. And if I make any mistakes, please let me know in the comments below. If you want to challenge me on any of these points, please let me know in the comments below. But the point is that Solo is not going to be making a lot of money, and it's going to end up losing Disney a lot of money. And that leaves us the question: is Disney going to pull back on Star Wars? Is Disney going to make a major change at Star Wars with the leadership? We honestly don't know at this point, but what we do know is that it's going to lose money, and then we know that Disney does indeed listen when money is involved, because as we know, they're buying up everything, and if they're losing money on a project, you're going to probably see some changes come down the pipe. I don't know what kind of changes we're going to get, but there's no way that they can just stay the way they are if they really hope and pray that Episode 9 is going to make money. Because based on this trend, again, we start off with $2 billion with The Force Awakens, and now we're getting to the point where this film is going to be roughly $500 million. They've got to take a major revamp of their overall projects if they want to make the money back on Episode 9, to be able to have enough cash to move forward with other projects in the future. So thank you guys very much for listening. Thanks for watching. Please hit that subscribe button if you liked what you heard. Please hit that like button if you like what you heard. But also leave me a comment down below if you have any questions or if you want to have a further conversation about this. Again, I love having conversations with you guys. So have a great day. And as always, God bless.